The canal does not move this morning. You might expect it to. The water is there, black and deep, running between the brick facades of Amsterdam's Herengracht as it always has. But something in the air holds everything still. The light is the particular grey of a northern October, soft and without shadow. The kind of light that makes the world feel as though it is waiting for permission to begin. It is 1602. The city smells of salt and tar and the faintly sweet rot of the canals in autumn. Somewhere behind you, a bakery has been burning wood since before the sky brightened, and the smell of bread moves through the cold air like a hand pressed gently against a shoulder. You're standing on a bridge. Below you, a flat-bottomed boat moves with almost no sound, its boatman leaning against his pole with the patience of a man who has nowhere urgent to be. The water folds around the hull and smooths itself back again. It is as though the boat was never there. Across the canal, a narrow house of dark brick rises 5 stories above its own reflection. In an upper window, a candle is still burning, though the sky has brightened enough to make it seem faintly optimistic, still lit against a dark that has already gone. In that room, or one very much like it, a man is bent over a ledger. He is writing a name. Beside the name, he is writing a number. The ink is still wet. He does not know, this man, this careful, methodical man with ink on his fingers, that he is writing the first line of something that will not end for 400 years. He does not know that the page he is filling will eventually be called a share register. He does not know that the act he is performing, recording ownership, assigning value to a fraction of a collective enterprise, will become the architecture of the modern world. He is simply doing the work in front of him, as most history is made. The candle flickers. He steadies the page with his left hand. The nib moves across the paper with the small, precise sound of a world being reorganized. To understand what was born in Amsterdam in 1602, you must first understand what the world smelled like before it, not metaphorically or literally. The great motivating force behind 5 centuries of European exploration, behind the rounding of Africa and the crossing of oceans that had never been crossed, behind the deaths of uncounted sailors and the displacement of entire civilizations, was, at its most essential, the desire to control the smell of food, to command the price of pepper, to hold in warehouses behind locked iron doors the dried flower buds and seed coatings and bark of trees that grew only on a scattering of small islands on the other side of the known world. Spices were not a luxury in the modern sense, a pleasant addition, something to be enjoyed and set aside. In the Europe of the 15th and 16th centuries, spices were infrastructure. They were technology. They were the difference between a winter of monotony and something approaching pleasure at the table. Pepper preserved meat imperfectly but meaningfully. Nutmeg and cloves were believed, with what we might now call enthusiastic inaccuracy, to ward off plague. Cinnamon, when it arrived, was considered almost miraculous, a substance so distant and so rare that its price reflected not just scarcity, but mythology. You must imagine a Europe largely without refrigeration, without the chemical preservatives that line the shelves of every modern pantry, without the year-round availability of fresh produce that our century takes entirely for granted. A European household of middling means in 1500 faced a winter that was, gastronomically speaking, an exercise in endurance. Salted fish, salted pork, dried legumes, bread that grew harder as the weeks passed. Into this landscape spices arrived like sudden colour, not just as flavour, but as evidence that elsewhere in the world warmth and abundance existed, and that it was possible for a price to import some small portion of that warmth and abundance to a cold northern table. The price was extraordinary. Pepper, the most ordinary of the spices, the one that found its way onto every table that could afford it, sold in medieval Europe for what amounted in modern terms to several $100 per kilogram. Nutmeg, which grew in useful quantities only on a clutch of islands in the Banda Sea that most Europeans could not have found on a map, commanded prices so high that a single nutmeg, sold at retail, could represent a week's wages for a skilled craftsman. This is the world that created the spice trade, and the spice trade, in time, created everything else. For centuries, the movement of spices from the islands of what we now call Indonesia to the tables of Europe followed a path of breathtaking complexity. The spices moved first by boat, in small craft along the coasts of the Indian Ocean, to the great entrepôts of the Asian trade, Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, Malacca at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, and eventually to the ports of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. From there, they were carried overland through the territories of the Ottoman Empire, taxed at every step, handled by intermediaries who each extracted their portion of the value until they arrived at the ports of the Eastern Mediterranean, Alexandria, Constantinople, Beirut, where Italian merchants, primarily from Venice and Genoa, purchased them and carried them to the consuming markets of northern and western Europe. By the time a bag of pepper arrived in Antwerp or London or Hamburg, it had passed through perhaps a dozen sets of hands, been taxed by perhaps half a dozen sovereigns, been stored and retransported and repriced at each stage of a journey that might have taken 2 years from its origin. Venice, which controlled the terminal end of this trade for much of the medieval period, grew fabulously wealthy on its position as the gatekeeper of spices to the European north. The Venetian merchants who dealt in pepper and nutmeg and cloves did not themselves travel to the Banda Sea. They did not need to. The geography of trade delivered the product to them, and they sold it onward at a price that reflected their indispensable position in the chain. Then, in 1453, Constantinople fell. The Ottoman conquest of the Byzantine capital did not immediately sever the spice trade. History rarely works so cleanly. But it introduced a new set of intermediaries, new tariffs, new political uncertainties into a supply chain that was already expensive, and it gave the rulers and merchants of Western Europe an acute awareness of their vulnerability. The route to the spices passed through territory controlled by a power that was, at best, indifferent to European commercial interests, and at worst, actively hostile to them. The response was not philosophical, it was geographical. If the overland route was too costly, too controlled, too politically fraught, then another route would be found. The spices would come by sea, directly from their source, bypassing the Ottoman Empire entirely, bypassing Venice and Genoa, and the whole expensive machinery of the overland trade. The Portuguese crown, positioned at the southwestern edge of Europe with access to the open Atlantic, and a tradition of maritime exploration that had already taken its sailors down the West African coast, grasped this possibility first, under the sustained methodical sponsorship of the crown, exemplified in the patronage of the prince known to history as Henry the Navigator. Portuguese sailors spent decades pushing further south along the African coast, seeking the end of the continent, the point at which a ship could turn eastward and sail into the Indian Ocean without asking permission of anyone. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded what would be named the Cape of Good Hope, and sailed briefly into the Indian Ocean before turning back. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey, all the way to Calicut, on the Malabar coast of India, where he filled his ships with pepper and cinnamon, and returned to Lisbon having demonstrated that the overland trade was, economically speaking, obsolete. Portugal moved quickly to capitalise on the discovery. Within 2 decades of da Gama's first voyage, the Portuguese had established a series of fortified trading posts along the Indian Ocean coast, at Goa, at Malacca, in the Moluccas, and had seized effective control of the seaborne spice trade. The Estado da India, as the Portuguese maritime empire came to be called, was not a colony in the later sense of the word. It was a network of armed commercial nodes, each one positioned to intercept the existing flows of trade and redirect them through Portuguese hands. The Portuguese did not grow spices. They taxed them. They forced Asian traders to carry valid Portuguese licenses, called cartesies, or risk having their ships seized. They imposed the logic of monopoly on a trade that had previously been open, if not free. For roughly a century, this arrangement worked. The Portuguese crown extracted enormous wealth from its position as the intermediary between the Spice Islands and the consuming markets of Europe. The old Venetian dominance of the spice trade withered. The overland route did not disappear entirely, but its commercial significance declined sharply. The world had been reorganized. Then Portugal too became vulnerable. In 1580, the Portuguese crown and the Spanish crown united under Philip II of Spain, creating a single Iberian superpower. For Spain and Portugal's commercial interests, this was an administrative convenience. For the Dutch Republic, which was at that moment engaged in a bitter, grinding war for independence from Spanish rule, it was a commercial catastrophe. Lisbon, the great hub of the Asian trade, was now technically an enemy port. The Dutch merchant ships that had for decades carried spices from Lisbon northward to the markets of Antwerp and Amsterdam were suddenly excluded. The pipeline of spices through which the northern European economy had been nourished was effectively closed. It was this exclusion, this sudden, politically imposed severance from the trade upon which so much of the Dutch economy depended, that produced the decisive response. If Lisbon would not sell, then Amsterdam would have to go to the source directly. The first Dutch expedition to the East Indies departed in 1595. 4 ships, 249 men, and a hold full of trade goods. The voyage was a near disaster. The ships took 14 months to reach Java. Scurvy, dysentery, and the general hostility of the journey reduced the crew to 87 men by the time the fleet limped back to Texel in 1597. The financial returns were at best marginal, but the merchants who had financed the expedition and the city of Amsterdam, which watched it return with the attention of a community that understood the stakes, knew that the route was open. The passage to the east was not a Portuguese secret. It was a matter of navigation, of endurance, of ships and capital and will. More expeditions followed, then more. By the turn of the 17th century, a dozen Dutch companies were sending fleets to the east, competing not just with the Portuguese but with each other. They were buying pepper and nutmeg and cloves from the same Asian traders, driving up the prices at the source and driving down the prices in the European market simultaneously. The economics were becoming rapidly untenable. Something would have to change. Not the ambition. The ambition was sound. But the structure, the competition, the way the Dutch were organising themselves to grasp what the world was offering. In the rooms of Amsterdam's counting houses, in the chambers of the States General in The Hague, in the minds of a small number of men who could see both the opportunity and the problem with equal clarity, an idea was taking shape. Not just a company. Something new, something that had not existed before in quite this form, a company owned by everyone who wished to own it, a company whose ownership could be divided into portions and whose sold portions could be sold again, and whose buyers and sellers could meet in a designated place to discover, through the aggregate of their individual judgments, what the thing was worth. The canal outside the counting house held its reflection steady. The ink dried on the page. The world waited, as it always does, for the next thing to begin. There is a particular quality to the light in the Low Countries that painters have been trying to capture for 500 years. It comes from the water. The Netherlands sits at the delta of 3 great rivers, the Rhine, the Maas and the Scheldt, and the landscape they have shaped is one of almost total flatness, a country that feels less built than deposited, as though the sea simply decided at some point to withdraw slightly and leave this particular arrangement of mud and sky and slow-moving water behind. The horizon is enormous, the clouds are operatic, and the light, filtered through the moisture that hangs perpetually in the air off the North Sea, has a quality of diffusion that makes the world seem illuminated from within rather than from above. It was into this landscape, this flat, water-threaded, perpetually damp and luminous landscape, that the Dutch Republic was born, and the Republic in turn gave the world something that the landscape seems, in retrospect, to have been preparing for all along, a culture of trade so thorough, so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life, that commerce became not merely an occupation but an identity. You must understand what was unusual about the Dutch Republic in the late 16th century, because its unusualness was not accidental. It was the product of specific circumstances, geographical, religious, political, that combined in a way that would not have been predictable and has not been repeated. The Republic was, in the most literal sense, the creation of necessity. The northern provinces of what is now the Netherlands had been under Habsburg rule, first Burgundian then Spanish, for the better part of a century. Philip II of Spain, who inherited these territories along with a vast empire in 1556, was a man of deep religious conviction and absolute political will. He was determined to suppress the Protestant Reformation that had taken hold in the northern provinces with particular tenacity, and he pursued this goal with a thoroughness that his subjects experienced as tyranny. The Duke of Alba, sent by Philip to reimpose order in 1567, established a Council of Troubles, known to those who appeared before it as the Council of Blood, that executed perhaps 10,000 people in its years of operation. The response was rebellion. The Dutch revolt, which began in earnest in 1568 and would not formally end until 1648, was one of the longest and most consequential struggles in European history. It produced, in its course, something that Philip II had not intended to create, a republic. The Union of Utrecht in 1579 bound the northern provinces together in a defensive alliance. The Act of Abjuration in 1581 formally declared independence from Spanish rule, one of the earlier such declarations in modern history, preceding the American Declaration of Independence by nearly 2 centuries. The republic that emerged from this struggle was unlike anything else in Europe. It had no king. It had no single sovereign. It was governed in a manner that confused and alarmed most of its contemporaries by a federation of provincial estates dominated by the merchant class, the Regenten, as they were called, the regent families whose wealth came from trade and whose political power derived from that wealth. They were not aristocrats in the traditional sense. They had not inherited their position through military service or royal favour. They had earned it generation by generation through the patient accumulation of commercial advantage. This merchant oligarchy was, by the standards of its time, extraordinarily tolerant. Not universally tolerant, there were limits, and the limits were periodically tested, but tolerant enough to create something genuinely unusual. A society in which ideas circulated relatively freely, in which religious minorities could live and work without constant fear of persecution, in which the practical demands of commerce placed a natural brake on the impulse toward doctrinal purity. The consequences of this tolerance were enormous. Antwerp, which had been the commercial capital of northern Europe in the first half of the 16th century, was sacked by Spanish troops in 1576 in an episode known as the Spanish Fury, 3 days of pillage and massacre that killed perhaps 8,000 people and destroyed a significant portion of the city. The merchants of Antwerp, many of them Protestant, many of them members of religious minorities, began to leave. They needed somewhere to go. They needed a city that was safe, that was commercially sophisticated, that had access to the sea. They came to Amsterdam. The influx of Antwerp's merchant community, along with waves of Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain and Portugal, Huguenot refugees from France, and skilled craftsmen and financiers from across the continent, transformed Amsterdam from a moderately prosperous trading town into one of the most commercially dynamic cities in the world within the space of a single generation. The population of Amsterdam roughly tripled between 1570 and 1600, from perhaps 30,000 to nearly 100,000. The city expanded physically. The great canal rings that define its geography were laid out in this period, and expanded commercially with even greater speed. What made Amsterdam different was not simply the accumulation of wealth. though the wealth was real and growing. It was the density of commercial knowledge. In a city where the merchant class governed, where trade was not a disreputable occupation, but the highest expression of civic virtue, the practical arts of commerce, accounting, credit, insurance, logistics, were practiced with a sophistication that had no parallel in the world. The double-entry bookkeeping that Luca Pacioli had codified in Venice a century earlier was standard practice in Amsterdam's counting houses. The marine insurance contracts that protected merchant ventures from the losses of storm and piracy were written, repriced, and traded among underwriters with a casualness that suggests long familiarity. You must also understand the geography, because the geography determined everything. Amsterdam sat at the mouth of the IJ, a tidal inlet that connected it to the Zuiderzee and through the Zuiderzee to the open North Sea. Its harbour was deep enough for the largest merchant vessels of the era. Its position on the western edge of the European continent made it a natural staging point for trade in both directions. Toward the Baltic in the north and east, where grain and timber and naval stores moved in enormous volume, and toward the Atlantic in the west, where the new trades with Africa, the Americas, and eventually Asia were opening. The Dutch had already mastered the Baltic trade. The herring fishery, which had migrated northward into Dutch waters in the 15th century, had been the original engine of Amsterdam's prosperity. Dutch fishermen developed the technique of gutting and salting herring at sea, allowing them to stay out longer and process larger catches than their competitors. The salted herring was then sold across northern Europe, to Germany, to Poland, to Scandinavia, and the ships that carried it returned laden with grain, which was then sold in the grain-deficient cities of the Atlantic coast. This triangular trade had made the Dutch the dominant carriers of European bulk goods by 1600, operating a merchant fleet that was larger than the fleets of England, France, and Germany combined. The Vloot, the cargo vessel that the Dutch had developed specifically for the Baltic trade, was a masterpiece of commercial engineering. It was wide-bodied and shallow-drafted, optimized for volume rather than speed, and it could be operated by a much smaller crew than comparable vessels of other nations, which meant that the cost per ton of cargo moved was substantially lower. The Dutch did not win the Baltic trade through superior goods or favourable geography alone. They won it through superior efficiency. They had learned, earlier than anyone else, that in commerce, the margin is the message. It was this combination, the commercial sophistication, the tolerant politics, the geographic advantage, the existing mastery of logistics and finance, the concentration of displaced talent from across Europe, that made Amsterdam the only city in the world capable of doing what it did in 1602. Other cities had merchants, other cities had capital, other cities had ambition. Amsterdam had the institutional ecology, the dense interconnected web of commercial practice and legal convention and social trust that could support something genuinely new. And the men who sat in Amsterdam's counting houses in 1601 and looked at the chaos of competing Dutch expeditions to the East Indies, the squandered capital, the undersold cargoes, the ruinous competition, and saw in that chaos the outline of a solution, were men shaped by this ecology. They thought in terms of capital and risk and return. They understood, in their bones, the difference between a venture that was merely brave and a venture that was structured to succeed. The great merger that would produce the VOC was not the product of idealism. It was the product of commercial calculation, pursued by men who had spent their lives making commercial calculations. They saw that the individual companies competing for the Asian trade were each too small, each too undercapitalized, each too exposed to the catastrophic losses that a single bad voyage could bring. They saw that competition among themselves was destroying the very profit they were competing to earn. They also saw something else, something that no one had quite seen before in quite this form. They saw that it was possible in principle to build a company so large, so well capitalized, so permanent in its structure, that the individual risks of each voyage would be absorbed into a much larger pool, spread across many voyages, many investors, many years. a company that did not live and die with each expedition, but persisted and accumulated and could be owned in portions, and whose portions could be passed from hand to hand like any other property. It is also worth noting what the Dutch Republic was not in 1602, because the contrast is as instructive as the substance. It was not a country with a strong landed aristocracy, whose values were fundamentally hostile to commerce. The great landowners of France and England, who looked down on trade as beneath the dignity of their class, had no real equivalent in the Dutch Republic, where the regent families who governed the cities drew their status directly from their commercial success. There was no cultural stigma attached to knowing the price of pepper. It was not a country governed by a church that regarded lending at interest as a sin requiring absolution. The Calvinist theology that dominated the Dutch Republic was not indifferent to moral concerns about commerce. There were Dutch theologians who worried deeply about the ethics of speculation and the proper relationship between profit and Christian virtue. But Calvinist theology was also, in practice, more accommodating of commercial activity than the Catholic theology it had displaced, and the commercial culture of Amsterdam developed in a theological atmosphere that was, at minimum, not actively hostile to financial innovation. It was not a country in which the legal system was so opaque, so dependent on noble privilege, so resistant to the claims of merchants that commercial disputes could not be reliably resolved. The Dutch legal system was not perfect, but it was reasonably accessible, reasonably predictable, and reasonably willing to enforce contracts between parties of unequal social status. This predictability, the confidence that a contract would be honoured, that a debt could be collected, that a dispute would be adjudicated on its merits rather than on the social standing of the parties, was the invisible foundation on which all commercial trust rested. These negative characteristics, the absence of anti-commercial aristocratic values, the absence of theologically grounded hostility to finance, the absence of an arbitrary and inaccessible legal system, were as important to what happened in Amsterdam in 1602 as the positive attributes of the city's commercial culture. The VOC could not have been founded in Madrid, where the aristocratic disdain for commerce would have made the public subscription unthinkable. It could not have been founded in Rome, where the Church's historical ambivalence about usury would have complicated the financial instruments the company needed. It could not have been founded in a city where contracts were not reliably enforced, because no investor would have trusted the structure with their guilders. Amsterdam was, in this sense, a city that had been built for this moment, not deliberately, not foresightedly, but by the accumulation of circumstances that, taken together, created the only place in the world where the VOC could have come into existence. The canal held its reflections. The grey sky pressed gently down on the rooftops. In the counting houses the quills moved across the paper, and the world, patient, indifferent, enormous, waited for what would come next. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The first Dutch ship to return from the East Indies arrived back in the harbour of Texel in August of 1597, and the city of Amsterdam received it the way cities receive news that changes their understanding of what is possible. The expedition had been brutal. Of the 249 men who had sailed with Cornelis de Houtman's 4 ships in April of 1595, only 87 returned. The losses came not from battle, though there had been conflict enough, but from the slow, grinding attrition of distance, scurvy, dysentery, malaria, the general physiological catastrophe of asking northern European bodies to endure a tropical ocean passage of 14 months without adequate nutrition or medical knowledge. The ships themselves had deteriorated. One had been abandoned in the Indian Ocean. The 3 that returned were in poor repair, and yet the cargo they carried, pepper primarily and some cloves, sold for enough to nearly cover the costs of the expedition. Nearly. The financial return, by any rigorous accounting, was marginal at best, but the information the voyage returned was priceless. The route was open, the trade was real, and the Portuguese monopoly on the sea passage to the east was, if not broken, at least cracked. What followed was a commercial gold rush of a particular Dutch variety, methodical, well-organised, and almost immediately self-defeating. The merchants of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Middelburg, and the other trading cities of the Republic were not naive. They understood that the first successful return was an invitation, not a guarantee. They understood that equipping ships for a 16,000-kilometre round journey required capital on a scale that exceeded any individual merchant's resources. They did what Dutch merchants had always done in the face of large risks. They formed syndicates. They pooled their capital, divided the risk, and sent ships. By 1598, there were 5 separate Dutch expeditions bound for the East Indies. By 1600, the number had grown further. The merchants called these ventures voorcompagnieën, pre-companies, and each one was organised as a separate joint venture, funded for a specific voyage, with profits to be distributed, and the company dissolved upon return. It was the standard model for maritime trade ventures, refined over centuries, and it worked tolerably well for individual expeditions. What it could not survive was competition with itself. The problem was structural and, once visible, was almost comically obvious. Every Dutch ship that arrived at the spice markets of Java or the Banda Islands arrived as a buyer competing against other Dutch buyers. The Asian traders who sold pepper and nutmeg and cloves were not ignorant of this situation. They watched the Dutch ships arrive, counted them, and adjusted their prices accordingly. Dutch competition among themselves had the predictable effect of raising the purchase price at the source. Then the same ships turned around and sailed home, where they arrived as sellers competing against other Dutch sellers. The European merchants who bought pepper and nutmeg and cloves watched the Dutch ships arrive, counted them, and adjusted their willingness to pay accordingly. Dutch competition among themselves had the equally predictable effect of depressing the sale price at the destination. The result was a commercial squeeze that threatened to strangle the very trade it was meant to exploit. The margins that had looked so promising after the first voyage were eroding with each subsequent expedition. The voorcompagnieën were collectively destroying the profitability that each individual company was trying to capture. The English were watching this with considerable interest. The English East India Company had been chartered by Queen Elizabeth I on the last day of December, 1600, just over a year before the VOC would receive its own charter. The English company was smaller, less well capitalised, and operating on a similar voyage-by-voyage model, but it existed. It was a competitor, and the presence of English ships in the waters where Dutch merchants were already undercutting each other added another layer of urgency to the problem. The solution, when it came from above. Not from the merchants themselves, who were too embedded in their individual competitive advantages to voluntarily surrender them, but from the political authority of the Republic, specifically from Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the advocate of Holland, the most powerful political figure in the Dutch Republic, and a man who possessed the unusual capacity to see both the commercial and the strategic dimensions of a problem simultaneously. Oldenbarnevelt had been watching the voorcompagnieën with the concern of a statesman who understood that the chaos of competition was not just commercially wasteful, but politically dangerous. The Republic was still at war with Spain. The spice trade was not merely a source of merchant profit, it was a source of state revenue through taxation and a source of strategic pressure on Spain and Portugal, whose colonial dominance the Dutch voyages were directly challenging. A fragmented, undercapitalised, mutually competing set of small companies could not sustain this pressure. What was needed was something larger, something unified, something with the capital base and the political authority to project Dutch power into the Indian Ocean on a sustained basis. The negotiations that Oldenbarnevelt orchestrated in 1601 and early 1602 were not easy. The merchants of the various voorcompagnieën were being asked to surrender their independent operations and merge into a single entity in which their individual shares of ownership would be determined by a formula that not everyone agreed was fair: Amsterdam The largest and most powerful of the trading cities would receive the largest share of the new company's capital and the largest share of its governance. The smaller chambers, Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, would receive proportionally smaller allocations. The city of Middelburg, representing the province of Zeeland, was particularly resistant. Zeeland had its own strong tradition of East Indies trade, its own fleet, its own merchant families with their own relationships in the Asian markets. The prospect of subsuming these assets into an Amsterdam-dominated company was not appealing. The negotiations required Oldenbarneveldt's considerable political skills, and the final settlement gave Zeeland a larger share than the strict population or capital might have warranted, as a concession to secure its participation. There were also the existing investors in the Voorkompanien to consider. Men who had put their capital into a specific voyage-by-voyage venture had done so with the expectation that their investment would be returned, with profit, when the voyage concluded. Now they were being told that their capital would instead be converted into shares of a permanent company, a company that might not distribute its profits for years, a company whose management would be appointed rather than elected, a company that could make decisions about their capital without their direct approval. This was not a small ask. The shift from a voyage-specific investment to a permanent shareholding was conceptually a significant one. It required investors to trust not just the outcome of a single voyage, but the indefinite future performance of an institution. It required them to believe that the share they held was not merely a claim on a specific cargo, but a genuine fractional ownership of an ongoing enterprise, something that could be valued, traded, and held as a long-term asset. That investors ultimately accepted this conversion, that they trusted enough in the new structure to surrender the familiar model for something unprecedented, tells you something important about the commercial culture of Amsterdam in 1602. It was a culture that had developed, through long practice, a sophisticated understanding of risk and an unusual tolerance for financial innovation. The merchants who subscribed to the VOC were not reckless. They were experienced, and their experience told them that this new structure, however unfamiliar, made commercial sense. The charter was ready. The subscription books were open. The world's first public company was about to be born. But before the books could open, there was one further problem to resolve, a problem that was, in its way, the most interesting of all the problems the VOC's founders had to solve. The new company would be capitalized through a public offering. Anyone who wished could invest. But how were the individual shares to be valued, and how were they to be transferred from one owner to another once the initial subscription was complete? The English East India Company, chartered just 2 years earlier, had adopted a structure in which investors subscribed to specific voyages and their capital was returned, with profits, when each voyage concluded. It was a clean model, easily understood, and it preserved the investor's ability to exit at a known point. But it was also a model that severely limited the scale of capital that could be raised, because every voyage required a fresh subscription. The permanent capital that the VOC's founders envisioned, the pool of investment that would remain committed across multiple voyages, multiple years, multiple decades, could not be organised on a voyage-by-voyage basis. The solution they arrived at was deceptively simple. The initial investors would subscribe to shares in the company as a whole, not in a specific voyage, not in a specific cargo, but in the enterprise itself, in its entirety, for its full operating life. Their capital would not be returned at the end of any particular voyage. It would remain invested. In exchange, they would receive dividends from the company's profits, distributed at the discretion of the directors, and they would hold the right to sell their shares to other investors if they wished to exit their position. The right to sell was not a minor provision. It was, in fact, the key to the whole structure. Without it, the commitment of capital to a permanent company would have been genuinely permanent, a one-way door through which an investor's funds disappeared and did not return except through dividends. The liquidity that the ability to sell provided transformed the investment from a locked-up commitment into something more like a property holding, an asset that could be valued, transferred, and used as collateral, and that therefore had a present value independent of the dividends it might someday generate. The mechanics of this transferability would be worked out in practice over the months and years that followed, but the principle was established in the Charter, and the principle was sufficient. VOC shares could be sold. The register would record the transfers. The company would persist regardless of which individuals held its shares at any given moment. In the pale light of the Amsterdam winter, the candles burned long in the counting houses. The quills moved. The figures were written and checked and written again. Somewhere in the harbour, a ship was being fitted with new rigging, its hull corked against the cold water of the North Sea, its hold slowly filling with the goods that would be traded for spices 10,000 kilometres away. The men who owned fractions of that ship did not need to sail on it. They did not need to know its captain by name, or follow its route on a map, or lie awake at night worrying about the monsoon. They needed only to hold their papers, and wait, and trust that the structure they had built was solid enough to bear the weight of distance and time. On the 20th of March, 1602, the States General of the Dutch Republic signed a document that was, in its external appearance, unremarkable. It was written on parchment, in the formal Dutch of legal convention, sealed with wax, and filed in the records of the government in The Hague. It was called an octroy, a charter, a grant of privilege, and it established in careful legal language the terms under which a new commercial enterprise would be permitted to operate. The Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. To look at the charter with modern eyes is to be struck by how much of what we take for granted in corporate law, the limited liability of shareholders, the separation of ownership from management, the legal personality of the corporation, appears here for the first time in anything resembling its modern form, written out in the pragmatic legal Dutch of the early 17th century. The men who drafted this document were not legal theorists. They were merchants and statesmen solving a practical problem. But in solving it, they created something that would last. The Charter established 6 chambers of the VOC, corresponding to the 6 cities whose merchant syndicates had been merged into the new company: Amsterdam, Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn, and Enkhuizen. Each chamber would maintain its own administration, its own fleet, its own books. Each would contribute to the company's capital in proportion to its share: Amsterdam at 50%, Zeeland at 25%, and the remaining 4 chambers dividing the last 25% among themselves. Governance of the company was vested in a board of directors called the Heren Assexitend, the 17 gentlemen. The name had a pleasant symmetry: 17 directors drawn from the 6 chambers in proportion to their capital shares, with Amsterdam holding 8 seats, Zeeland 4, and the smaller chambers 1 each, with the 17th seat rotating among the non-Amsterdam chambers on a periodic basis. The Heren Assexitenden would meet 3 times a year, alternating between Amsterdam and Middelburg, and would make the decisions that governed the company's operations: where the ships would sail, what goods they would carry, what prices they would accept, how the profits would be distributed. The Charter granted the VOC a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. This was not merely a commercial privilege, it was a geographic empire drawn on paper. Everything within those boundaries, all the trade routes, all the markets, all the commercial relationships that any Dutch merchant might develop in that vast region, were the exclusive property of the VOC. No Dutch subject could trade in those waters without the company's permission. Those who tried would have their goods confiscated. The monopoly was granted for 21 years, renewable at the discretion of the States General. But the VOC's founders understood that 21 years was, in commercial terms, barely long enough to recoup the initial investment, let alone build the kind of permanent presence they envisioned. The Charter's provision for renewal was not a constraint but an understanding, a recognition that the relationship between the Republic and its great trading company would be ongoing, mutually beneficial, and effectively permanent. The most extraordinary provisions of the Charter, however, were not the commercial ones. They were the political ones. The VOC was granted, in explicit terms, powers that had traditionally been reserved for sovereign states. It could make war, it could conclude treaties with Asian rulers, it could establish colonies and fortifications in its areas of operation. It could administer justice, including criminal justice, over its own employees and, within its territories, over others. It could issue its own currency. It could raise its own army and navy. These were not the powers of a trading company. They were the powers of a government, and the States General granted them with full awareness of what they were doing, because the Republic, engaged in a war for its own survival against the greatest military power in Europe, needed the VOC to project Dutch power into the Indian Ocean on a scale that the state itself could not afford to sustain. The VOC was not merely a commercial enterprise. It was an instrument of Dutch foreign policy, a private extension of Dutch sovereignty into the world's most lucrative trading region. The concept of corporate legal personhood, the idea that a company is, in law, a person, capable of owning property, entering contracts, suing and being sued, persisting beyond the deaths of its individual members, was not invented by the VOC's charter. Roman law had grappled with the idea of legal entities that transcended their individual members, and medieval European law had developed the concept of the corporation in the context of guilds, universities, and ecclesiastical bodies. But the VOC's charter applied this concept to a commercial enterprise in a way that was genuinely new. The critical innovation was permanence combined with transferability. Earlier joint ventures had pooled capital for specific projects, a single voyage, a specific trading expedition, with the understanding that the capital would be returned and the venture dissolved when the project concluded. The VOC's capital was not to be returned at the end of a voyage. It was to remain invested in the company indefinitely. The company would persist, accumulate, and operate as a going concern across multiple voyages, multiple years, multiple generations. And the shares that represented ownership of this permanent company, the portions of its initial capitalization that investors had subscribed to, were freely transferable. An investor who wished to exit his position did not need to wait for the company to dissolve. He could sell his shares to another party, and the new party would step into his position as a fractional owner of the company. The company would continue unchanged as the ownership of its shares circulated among buyers and sellers. This was the crucial insight, stated so quietly in the Charter that it is easy to miss its significance. The separation of the company's existence from the existence of any particular investor. The company could outlast any shareholder. The shareholder could exit without disrupting the company. The two were linked. The shareholder owned a portion of the company, and the company's performance affected the value of the shareholder's portion, but they were not identical. They could move independently. The implications of this separation would take decades to fully manifest. But they were present from the beginning, written into the Charter in careful legal Dutch, sealed with wax, filed in The Hague. The initial capitalization target was large, larger than any previous commercial venture in Dutch history. The subscription was to be open to all residents of the Dutch Republic, without distinction of wealth or social status. The minimum subscription was 50 guilders, a sum that represented roughly a week's wages for a skilled craftsman, and that had been set deliberately low to encourage broad participation. The maximum subscription was unlimited. What this meant in practice was that the VOC would be owned by a genuinely diverse cross-section of Dutch society, not just the great merchant families of Amsterdam, but traders of modest means, craftsmen, widows living on fixed incomes, civic officials, clergymen. The ownership of a fragment of a great commercial enterprise would be available, for the first time in history, to anyone with 50 guilders and the will to subscribe. The Charter was signed. The subscription books were prepared. The parchment, still smelling faintly of the ink that had dried upon it, was rolled and stored in its case. There is one further provision of the Charter worth dwelling on, because it speaks to the political genius, or perhaps the political audacity, of the men who drafted it. The VOC's shareholders were legally insulated from the company's debts. If the company incurred obligations it could not meet, creditors could not pursue the individual investors for repayment. The investors' risk was limited to the capital they had subscribed, nothing more. This concept, limited liability as it would come to be called, was not entirely new in 1602. Medieval law had developed various forms of partnership in which some partners bore limited exposure to the partnership's debts. But the application of limited liability to a publicly held company, with hundreds or thousands of shareholders who had no active role in management, was genuinely novel. It solved a problem that would otherwise have made the entire enterprise impossible. Consider the alternative. If every VOC shareholder were personally liable for the company's debts, if a silk dyer in Middelburg who had invested his 50 guilders could be sued by the company's creditors for an unlimited amount if the company became insolvent, then the rational decision would be to avoid investing entirely. The potential downside would be catastrophic. You might lose not just your 50 guilders, but your house, your tools, your livelihood. No rational person would accept such exposure for the sake of a share in a distant trading company. Limited liability changed the calculus entirely. If the most you could lose was your 50 guilders, then the decision to invest became a straightforward evaluation of risk and potential return. You might lose your 50 guilders if things went badly. You might earn a handsome dividend if things went well. The bounded nature of the downside made the investment accessible to people who would otherwise have stayed out of the market entirely, which was precisely the point. The combination of limited liability and transferable shares created an investment structure that was, for the first time, genuinely accessible to the non-wealthy. You did not need to be rich to participate. You needed only enough to subscribe at the minimum level, and the confidence that your subscription would not expose you to ruin if the company failed. This combination is so fundamental to the modern financial system that it is difficult to remember how radical it was in 1602, how much intellectual and legal work had to be done to establish the principle that an investor's obligation ended at the boundary of their investment. Outside, the city went about its business. The canals carried their boats. The bakeries filled the cold air with a smell of bread. The harbour bristled with masts, and in the counting houses along the Wammerstraat and the Kloveniersburgwal, the men who had spent months negotiating the terms of this document began to prepare for what would happen next, the opening of the subscription and the question of whether the people of the Republic would invest their faith and their guilders in something that had never existed before. The subscription books opened in 6 Dutch cities in the spring and summer of 1602, and what happened in those weeks has no precise precedent in the history of commerce. The process was simple. In each of the 6 chambers, Amsterdam, Middelburg, Delft, Rotterdam, Hoorn and Enkhuizen, a register was established, a large-bound ledger kept by the company's bookkeeper, in which anyone who wished to invest could appear, state their name and address, declare the sum they intended to subscribe, and have that sum recorded. No paper certificates were issued, no physical tokens of ownership changed hands. The register itself was the record. Your name in the book beside your number was your ownership. In Amsterdam, the subscription was managed from the house of a prominent merchant on the Keizersgracht, and the queue of people waiting to enter their names reportedly stretched into the street. The image is worth holding for a moment. A line of people on a canal-side street in early 17th century Amsterdam, waiting to write their names in a book that would define, in some measure, their financial futures. They were not all wealthy. They were not all men. They were not all members of the merchant class. They were, in a meaningful sense, the public, investing in a public company for the first time in history. The subscription in Amsterdam alone collected 3,679,915 guilders, more than half of the company's total initial capitalisation of 6,124,588 guilders. The remaining chambers contributed the balance, with Zeeland's Middelburg chamber accounting for the lion's share of the provincial total. When the books closed, the VOC had raised a sum that was, by the standards of the era, almost incomprehensibly large, equivalent in modern terms to tens of billions of dollars, though such conversions are inevitably imprecise. Among the subscribers were some of the most prominent merchant families of Amsterdam. Isaac Lemaire, who would later become one of the company's most troublesome shareholders, subscribed for 85,000 guilders, making him one of the largest individual investors. Dirk van Os, one of the founding directors, subscribed for 57,000 guilders. But alongside these great names were smaller ones. A silk dyer from Middelburg who subscribed for 150 guilders, a widow in Delft who entered her name for 100 guilders, a carpenter's assistant in Enkhuizen who managed 50. The minimum subscription had been set low deliberately, and people took advantage of it. The 50 guilder minimum deserves a moment's attention. 50 guilders in 1602 represented roughly what a skilled Amsterdam craftsman might earn in 10 days of work. Significant, but not prohibitive for a household that had been careful with its savings. The decision to set this floor was conscious and consequential. It meant that the VOC's ownership would be, from the beginning, genuinely distributed across Dutch society in a way that no previous commercial venture had been. This was not a company owned exclusively by great merchant houses. It was a company owned, in small portions, by the Republic's working population. The process of recording these subscriptions, the act of entering names and numbers in a ledger, of establishing who owned what portion of the enterprise, was, in retrospect, the invention of the share register. It seems obvious now, this idea that ownership should be recorded in a book, but the clarity of the hindsight obscures how genuinely novel the mechanism was. Earlier commercial ventures had pool arrangements, partnership agreements, claims on specific cargoes. The VOC's subscription register was something different, a comprehensive record of fractional ownership in a permanent enterprise, maintained by the company itself, and serving as the definitive proof of who owned what. The shares that the subscription register recorded were denominated in guilders. Each subscription entry was simply a number of guilders invested, but they were, in practice, fractional claims on the entire enterprise. A subscription of 3,000 guilders in the Amsterdam Chamber gave the subscriber a claim to 3,617,915 of the Amsterdam Chamber's share of the company, and, through that, a proportional claim on the company's profits, assets, and eventual distributions. This fractional structure meant that shares could be bought and sold in any size. There was no fixed unit of a single share, no indivisible quantum of ownership. Two parties who wished to transact could agree on any portion. 500 guilders, 200 guilders, 3,750 guilders, and record the transfer in the register. The seller's entry would be reduced by the agreed amount. The buyer's entry would be increased by the same amount. The register would be updated. The transaction would be complete. The transfer process required both parties to appear before the company's bookkeeper or to send authorized agents. The bookkeeper would verify that the seller held at least the amount they wished to transfer, record the transfer in the appropriate register, and issue a written receipt. The receipt was not itself a transferable instrument. It was simply a record of what had happened. The register entry was the ownership. What this meant in practice was that the secondary market for VOC shares, the trading of existing shares between buyers and sellers, as opposed to the primary subscription, was from the very beginning a matter of ledger entries and personal appearances. To buy VOC shares in 1603, you needed to find someone willing to sell, agree on a price, and both appear before the bookkeeper to record the transfer. This was cumbersome by the standards of what would follow, but it was functional, and it worked. The price at which shares changed hands in this secondary market was not fixed. It was whatever buyer and seller agreed upon, and the factors that influenced what they agreed upon were, in principle, the same factors that influence equity prices today. The perceived future profitability of the company, the current level of demand for shares, the availability of alternative investments, the general state of confidence in the economy. In 1602, as the subscription was closing and the company's first fleets were being assembled, there were probably people in Amsterdam who would have paid more than the subscription price for VOC shares, who believed, that is, that the company's future was bright enough to justify a premium. There were probably also people who had subscribed and were now having second thoughts, who would have sold for less. The mechanism that would eventually bring these buyers and sellers together, the stock exchange, did not yet exist in its organised form. But the conditions that would create it were already present. A large number of owners of a transferable asset, each with their own view of what that asset was worth, seeking to buy or sell. The exchange would emerge, as institutions so often do, not from a plan, but from the repeated practice of people doing what was convenient. For the moment, the subscription was complete. The books were closed. The total had been recorded. The Heeren 17 could look at the figures and know, perhaps with some satisfaction, perhaps with the slight vertigo that accompanies the accomplishment of something genuinely unprecedented, that they were now the governors of the most heavily capitalized commercial enterprise in human history. The money was real. The obligation was real. The ships that would carry it into the Indian Ocean were real, being fitted in the harbour with provisions and trade goods and the weapons that the VOC's charter empowered it to deploy. Somewhere in that harbour, the smell of tar and salt and fresh-cut timber mixed with the smell of the canal and the smell of the city, and the whole particular fragrance of a world on the edge of something it did not yet have the words to name. The secondary market that emerged in the weeks and months following the close of the subscription was not organised in any formal sense. There was no designated place for buyers and sellers to meet. There were no brokers appointed to facilitate transactions. There were no published price lists or official quotations. There was simply the ordinary commercial sociability of Amsterdam, the coffee houses and taverns along the Warmoestraat, the quaysides where merchants met to discuss the latest news from the harbour, the networks of personal relationship through which information and opportunity circulated. In these informal spaces, the first secondary transactions in VOC shares took place. A merchant who had subscribed and now needed liquidity would approach his acquaintances with the information that he had shares to sell. A merchant who had missed the subscription and wished to participate would let it be known that he was in the market to buy. A price would be negotiated, informally, without ceremony, in the way that prices had always been negotiated between merchants who knew each other, and the two parties would walk together to the Amsterdam Chamber to record the transfer in the register. The prices at which these early transfers took place reflected the market's initial assessment of the VOC's prospects. In the weeks immediately following the close of the subscription, with the company's first fleet being assembled in the harbour and the mood of commercial optimism high, shares appear to have changed hands at or near the subscription price. Within a year, as the news from the first expedition filtered back through the commercial networks, and as the logistical challenges of equipping and dispatching a fleet of the required scale became apparent, prices fluctuated in ways that were, for the first time in commercial history, expressing a collective market judgment about the value of an ongoing enterprise. It was this capacity for price discovery, for the continuous real-time revelation of what buyers were willing to pay and sellers were willing to accept, that distinguished the VOC share market from everything that had come before it. Previous commercial arrangements had prices, of course. Pepper had a price, silk had a price, a ship had a price. But these were prices for specific tangible goods, negotiated between parties who could inspect the goods and assess their quality directly. The VOC share was something different, a claim on the future earnings of an enterprise that was, at the moment of the transaction, spread across an ocean, in process, uncertain. To price such a claim was to make a judgment about the future. It was to commit to a belief, expressed in guilders, recorded in a ledger, about what the world would look like months and years hence. This is what markets do, and the VOC share market was the first place in history where this was done systematically, with a large number of participants, for a complex ongoing enterprise. The subscribers went home. Some of them told their neighbours what they had done, and their neighbours perhaps shook their heads, investing in a company that would send ships to the other side of the world, a company that might not pay a dividend for years. Others perhaps nodded and thought about their own 50 guilders, and wondered whether they should have subscribed as well. The register sat in the Amsterdam chamber, the ink dry on its pages, the names and numbers waiting with the patience of paper. A market for shares requires more than shares. It requires a currency that can be trusted, a system of payment that is reliable, and an institutional structure that gives buyers and sellers confidence that their transactions will be honoured. Without these foundations, the most well-designed financial instrument is merely an interesting idea. The Dutch understood this earlier than most. The VOC's subscription had been completed in 1602, and the company's shares were beginning to circulate in the informal secondary market that had sprung up almost immediately among Amsterdam's merchants. But the financial infrastructure of the Dutch Republic in 1602 had a significant weakness: its currency. The problem was not unique to the Netherlands. It was a condition of European commerce in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it was maddening. Across the continent, hundreds of different coins circulated simultaneously, gold and silver coins minted by different sovereigns in different weights, with different purities, subject to debasement by rulers who needed revenue, worn by use, clipped by thieves, and valued differently by different merchants in different cities. The exchange rate between any two currencies at any given moment was not a fixed ratio, but a matter of negotiation, subject to the expertise and honesty of the money changers who mediated between them. For a trader who needed to pay a supplier in Hamburg while collecting payment from a customer in Antwerp and maintaining a deposit in Amsterdam, this monetary chaos was not an inconvenience. It was an active obstacle to doing business. Every transaction across currency boundaries involved friction. The friction of finding a money changer, the friction of negotiating an exchange rate, the friction of uncertainty about whether the coins you received were what they claimed to be, the friction of the time value of money lost in the process. Amsterdam had become, by the early 17th century, the most important financial centre in Northern Europe, and the money changers and exchange merchants who mediated its currency flows had accumulated considerable expertise. But expertise in navigating a broken system is not the same as the system working. The city's merchants knew this. The city's government, which was composed of merchants, knew it too. In 1609, 7 years after the VOC's founding and 3 years after its first fleet had returned from the East Indies, the city of Amsterdam established the Wisselbank, the exchange bank. It was a public institution, owned and guaranteed by the city, and its purpose was to solve the currency problem once and for all, at least within the sphere of Amsterdam's commerce. The mechanism was simple in design, if complex in execution. Merchants could deposit their coins, whatever coins, from whatever jurisdiction, in whatever state of wear or purity, at the Wisselbank. The bank's assayers would weigh and test each deposit, determine its actual silver or gold content, and credit the depositor's account with an equivalent value expressed in a standardized unit, the bankguilder or bankgeld. The bankguilder was a unit of account, not a physical coin. It existed only as a number in the bank's ledger, but it was backed by the actual precious metal content of the coins that had been deposited, held in the bank's vaults. To make a payment in the Wisselbank system, a merchant simply instructed the bank to transfer bank guilders from their account to the account of their counterparty. No coins needed to change hands, no exchange rate needed to be negotiated, no money changers needed to be consulted. The transfer was recorded in the ledger, both parties' accounts were updated, and the transaction was complete. The bank guilder held its value with extraordinary stability because the Wisselbank did not lend out the deposits it received, or at least it maintained this as a principle for most of its early history. The coins sat in the vault. The bank guilders in the ledger were fully backed by metal. There was no fractional reserve, no credit creation, no possibility that a run on the bank could exhaust its resources. The bank guilder was, in a meaningful sense, the most reliable unit of account in the world. The effect on Amsterdam's commercial life was immediate and profound. Merchants who had previously spent hours negotiating exchange rates and hours more verifying the authenticity of coins could now settle transactions with a ledger entry. The friction of commerce decreased. The velocity at which capital could move increased. The volume of trade that Amsterdam could handle grew, but the Wisselbank's significance for the VOC and the emerging stock market was subtler and perhaps more important than mere transactional efficiency. By providing a stable, reliable unit of account in which prices could be expressed and transactions settled, the Wisselbank created the monetary foundation on which a secondary market for securities could function. Consider what it means to have a reliable price for a VOC share. A price is only as meaningful as the unit in which it is expressed. If the guilder were unstable, if its value varied depending on which coins you happened to be holding, if the exchange rates at which it could be converted to other currencies fluctuated unpredictably, then the price of a VOC share in guilders would convey ambiguous information. Is the share worth more today than yesterday because the company's prospects have improved, or because the guilder has weakened? The signal would be corrupted by monetary noise. The bank guilder eliminated this noise, at least within Amsterdam's commercial sphere. When VOC shares were priced in bank guilders, and when the bank guilder was stable, the price was a clear signal. It told you what buyers were willing to pay and what sellers were willing to accept, denominated in a unit that meant the same thing to everyone. This clarity was not a luxury for a functioning securities market, it was a precondition. The Wisselbank also provided something equally valuable, a safe place to hold the proceeds of transactions. A merchant who sold VOC shares received bank guilders in their Wisselbank account. Those bank guilders were safe, backed by metal, guaranteed by the city, immune to the credit risk that attended private deposits. The merchant could then use those bank guilders to buy other goods, to fund other ventures, to make other investments, confident that the money would be there when needed. The relationship between the Wisselbank and the VOC was not merely incidental, it was symbiotic. The VOC was the largest and most important commercial enterprise in Amsterdam. Its shares were the most important asset traded in the emerging securities market. The Wisselbank provided the monetary infrastructure that made that market function smoothly. In turn, the activity of the securities market generated transaction flows that passed through the Wisselbank, enhancing the bank's utility and reinforcing its central position in Amsterdam's financial life. There is something deeply Dutch about this arrangement, the practical, incremental, institution-building approach to the problems of commerce. The VOC had been founded to solve the problem of competition. The Wisselbank was founded to solve the problem of currency. Neither was a grand theoretical project. Both were responses to specific, identified problems, designed by practical men who understood the mechanics of trade. And together, they created something greater than the sum of their parts, a financial ecosystem that would set the template for the modern world. In the vaults beneath the Wisselbank's building on the Rock-in, the coins accumulated. Silver from the mines of Potosi, routed through Spain and Portugal and Holland. Gold from West Africa, carried north by the Dutch slave traders whose business would later become one of the Republic's great moral catastrophes. Copper coins, worn thin, from a dozen mints across northern Europe. All of it weighed, assayed, catalogued, and transformed into the clean, reliable numbers that circulated in the bank's ledger. The Wisselbank also served a function that becomes apparent only when you consider the practical mechanics of a securities market operating at scale. Every transaction in the secondary market for VOC shares required a payment. The buyer needed to transfer funds to the seller in exchange for the share transfer recorded in the company's register. In a world without a reliable clearing system, this payment was itself a transaction fraught with the same monetary uncertainties that afflicted all commercial settlement: which coins to use, at what exchange rate, how to verify their authenticity. The Wisselbank's ledger transfers solved this problem. A buyer and seller who were both Wisselbank depositors could settle a share transaction through a simple instruction to the bank: transfer a specified number of bank guilders from the buyer's account to the seller's account. The settlement was instantaneous, irrevocable, and entirely free of the friction that attended coin-based settlement. No coins needed to change hands, no exchange rates needed to be negotiated. No authenticity checks were required. The result was a clearing system for securities transactions that was, by the standards of the era, remarkably efficient. The bank guilder served simultaneously as the unit in which share prices were expressed, the medium in which share transactions were settled, and the store of value in which the proceeds of share sales could be safely held. This triple function, unit of account, medium of exchange, store of value, is what economists identify as the defining characteristics of money, and the bank guilder performed all three functions for the Amsterdam securities market with a reliability that no other monetary instrument in the world could match. It is worth pausing to appreciate what this combination of institutions, the VOC, the Beurs, the Wisselbank, had created by the second decade of the 17th century. A publicly held corporation with transferable shares, traded in an organised market, settled through a reliable clearing system denominated in a stable currency. This is, in its essentials, the architecture of the modern financial system. It emerged not from a grand plan but from the pragmatic, sequential solution of specific commercial problems by men who were trying, in each case, to do the next useful thing. Above the vaults, in the city, the numbers moved. They moved between merchants settling trade debts. They moved between investors buying and selling shares. They moved through the financial system of the Dutch Republic with an ease and reliability that was, to contemporaries familiar with the monetary chaos that prevailed elsewhere in Europe, nothing short of miraculous. The architecture of trust was being built, stone by stone, ledger entry by ledger entry. It was unglamorous work. But the building it produced would stand for centuries. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The building that Hendrik de Keyser designed for the Amsterdam Beurs, the stock exchange, was completed in 1611, and it stood at the heart of the city in the way that only buildings serving genuinely essential functions can stand, not as an ornament, but as an organ. It occupied a large rectangular plot on the Rokin, the filled-in section of the Amstel River that ran through the centre of the city, and its architecture was classical in the style of the Dutch Renaissance. Restrained, orderly, built of brick and sandstone with a colonnade running around its interior courtyard and an arcade opening onto the street. It was, by the standards of the great commercial buildings of the age, neither the most elegant nor the most imposing structure that money could produce, but it was designed for function, and its function was clear from the moment you stepped inside. The central courtyard, open to the sky, surrounded by covered arcades, was the trading floor. It was divided into sections, each assigned to a specific type of commerce. Grain merchants gathered in one area, textile merchants in another, Baltic traders in a third, insurers in a fourth. And along one particular section of the arcade, by a custom that developed organically rather than by any formal designation, the traders in VOC shares congregated. You must try to see it as it was, not the austere, institutionalized space that a modern stock exchange presents, but something more like a permanent outdoor market, with the sounds and smells and social complexity that a market implies. The air in the Beurs courtyard would have carried the smell of wool from nearby textile warehouses, the faint salinity of the harbour a few hundred metres away, the particular human warmth of hundreds of bodies in close proximity. The noise would have been considerable, the overlapping voices of merchants calling prices, the counterpoint of argument and agreement, the occasional sharp percussion of a hand slap when a deal was struck. The men who traded VOC shares in the Beurs in its early years were a mixed company. At one end of the social spectrum were the great merchant investors, men like Louis de Geer, the Swedish-based iron merchant, or Peter Lintgens, whose family had connections to the original Voorkompanien, who held large positions and traded in volumes that could move the market. At the other end were the smaller players, the money changers, the brokers, the speculators of modest means, who had learned that the difference between what they paid for a share today and what they could sell it for tomorrow was a legitimate and lucrative occupation. Between these two extremes was a world of financial intermediaries, the makelaars, or brokers, who earned their living by finding buyers for sellers and sellers for buyers, taking a small commission from each transaction. The broker was not a new figure in Dutch commerce. The word makelaar appears in Amsterdam records well before 1602. But the vague share market gave the broker a new importance, because the shares themselves were more complex instruments than the commodities or currencies that had previously been the main objects of brokerage. A buyer of pepper needed to evaluate the quality and quantity of the pepper. A buyer of VOC shares needed to evaluate the future prospects of an enterprise whose operations were distributed across 10,000 kilometres of ocean and half a dozen Asian trading posts. The broker who understood those prospects, who had access to news from returning ships, who had relationships with the company's directors, who had developed the judgment to distinguish signal from noise in the flow of commercial information, was worth paying. The news that affected VOC share prices was, by necessity, old news by the time it arrived. A ship returning from Batavia, the Valky's base of operations on Java, had spent 6 to 8 months at sea. The information it carried about the state of the Asian trade, the prices of spices, the political situation in the trading posts, had been accurate when it left, but was months stale by the time it reached Amsterdam. Yet this stale information was still valuable, because it was the best information available, and the market priced shares based on the best information available. The practical effect was that share prices in the Beurs moved in waves tied to the rhythm of the shipping calendar. When a fleet was known to be approaching, when runners posted along the coast sent word ahead of a sail on the horizon, prices would begin to move before the ships had even docked, before anyone knew whether the cargo was large or small, whether the voyage had been profitable or disastrous. The market was discounting future information, pricing in expectations, behaving in ways that would be recognizable to any modern trader, even though the instruments and the setting were so different. The derivative instruments that emerged in the Beurs in the decade after the VOC's founding are a testament to the creative ingenuity of Amsterdam's financial community. Forward contracts, agreements to buy or sell shares at a specified price on a future date, appeared very early, enabling merchants to lock in prices before the arrival of a fleet whose cargo quality was unknown. Options. The right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell shares at a specified price within a specified period, followed, giving investors the ability to take leveraged positions with limited downside. Short selling, the practice of selling shares you did not own, with the intention of buying them back at a lower price before the delivery date, profiting from the decline, also appeared, and would shortly become the subject of the world's first securities regulation. These instruments were not the result of theoretical financial engineering. They emerged from the practical needs of merchants managing real risks. A merchant who had subscribed to VOC shares and was now worried about a potential decline in the company's value needed a way to protect himself without selling his underlying position. The option gave him that protection. A speculator who believed that VOC shares were overvalued and would fall needed a way to profit from that belief without first accumulating the shares to sell. The short sale mechanism gave him that ability. The physical space of the Beurs also served a social function that was perhaps as important as its commercial one. It was a place where information circulated. Merchants gathered there not only to trade but to talk, to share news from the harbour, to speculate about the next fleet's return, to debate the implications of political developments in Asia or Europe for the company's prospects. The Beur was, in this sense, an information exchange as much as a securities exchange, a place where the distributed knowledge of Amsterdam's merchant community was pooled and processed. This informal information pooling function was the ancestor of the analyst reports, earnings calls and continuous news feeds that modern investors take for granted. The mechanism was different on gossip and hearsay rather than regulated disclosure. But the underlying function was the same, aggregating dispersed information into prices that reflected a collective judgment about value. There is a painting by Emmanuel de Witt, completed in the 1650s, that shows the interior of the Amsterdam Beurs on a trading day. The courtyard is crowded with men in the dark clothing of Dutch merchants, broad-brimmed hats, long coats, the occasional flash of a white rough collar. They are talking, gesturing, consulting small notebooks, arguing with the focused intensity of people whose livelihoods depend on the quality of their decisions. The light falls from above, diffuse and even, that characteristic Dutch light that renders everything with equal clarity, without dramatic shadow. Looking at this painting, it is possible to feel the weight of what was happening in this room. The world's first stock exchange was not an abstract concept or a theoretical innovation. It was this: a crowd of men in a brick courtyard talking about numbers that represented pieces of a company that was sailing ships through tropical storms 10,000 kilometers away. The distance between the courtyard and the ocean was enormous. The translation of that distance into the prices being negotiated, the rendering of wind and monsoon, and the quality of the nutmeg harvest into guilders and bank guilders and forward contracts, was the achievement of the Beurs. When the trading day ended, and the Beurs had no fixed closing time, trading simply tapered as the afternoon light faded and the merchants drifted away to their counting houses and their canal-side homes. The prices that had been discovered in the courtyard's noise and negotiation were not written on a board or published in a sheet. They were carried in the memories and notebooks of the men who had been there, transmitted through the city's commercial networks by word of mouth, and would inform the opening of the next day's trading. The city settled into its evening quiet. The canals darkened. The candles came on in the counting houses and the canal-side houses, small warm rectangles of light in the deepening grey. And the prices, those collective judgments, those aggregated beliefs about the value of a fraction of a company sailing the Indian Ocean, settled into the city's memory like sediment, ready to shift when the morning brought new information, new ships, new news from the other side of the world. There is a particular quality to the silence of the open ocean that no landlocked description can quite capture. 3 weeks out of Texel, the Dutch coast has long since disappeared below the horizon, and what surrounds the ship is a world with no fixed points, only water and sky and the ship itself, moving through both with the slow, rolling patience of something that is committed to its course. The crew are settled into the rhythms of the watch system. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, a cycle that breaks the day into manageable fragments and imposes a structure on the formlessness of ocean time. In the equatorial heat of the African coast, the tar between the deck planks softens and rises, giving the air a faintly industrial sweetness. At night, in the clear dark far from any coast, the stars are numerous beyond counting. This was the reality underlying the numbers in the Amsterdam Beurs. While the merchants in the Beurs courtyard negotiated prices and argued forward contracts, the actual objects of their negotiation, the ships, the cargoes, the men whose labour made the enterprise possible, were somewhere in this vast, indifferent ocean, carrying the weight of Amsterdam's financial hopes through weather that had no interest in anyone's investment thesis. A typical VOC fleet of the early 17th century consisted of between 4 and 8 ships, departing in the autumn when the winds off the Dutch coast were favourable for an Atlantic passage. The flagship, the largest and most heavily armed vessel, carried the fleet commander, the supercargo who would manage the trading operations, the surgeons, the clergymen, and the senior officers. The smaller ships carried additional goods, additional guns, and the mass of common sailors and soldiers whose labour would sustain the voyage. The ships themselves were the product of the same Dutch engineering genius that had produced the fleet for the Baltic trade, but adapted for the demands of a much longer and more hazardous voyage. The VOC's East Indiamen, Returschepen they were called, return ships, were broader and deeper than the Baltic fleets, built to carry large cargoes over long distances and to fight if necessary. They were heavily armed, the guns stacked in tiers along the main deck and the gun deck below, because the Indian Ocean was not a peaceful body of water. Portuguese warships, local pirates, rival European traders, and occasionally the fleets of Asian rulers who objected to the VOC's increasingly aggressive commercial tactics, all posed threats that the company's vessels needed to be capable of meeting. The route from the Netherlands to the East Indies had been refined by experience into a standard passage. From Texel, the fleet would sail south along the European and African coasts, passing the Canary Islands and the Cape Verde Islands until it reached the equatorial latitude where the trade winds became reliable. Then it would cross the Atlantic on a wide arc, swinging far to the west, sometimes almost to the coast of Brazil, before turning southeast toward the Cape of Good Hope. This oceanic loop, counterintuitive on a flat map, was the product of hard-won knowledge about the wind systems of the South Atlantic. The direct route down the African coast, which early navigators had tried, was plagued by calms and contrary winds. The Great Arc was faster, despite being longer. Rounding the Cape was the physical and psychological midpoint of the voyage. The waters off the southern tip of Africa had a reputation, well earned, for ferocity. The convergence of the cold Benguela current from the Atlantic and the warmer Agulhas current from the Indian Ocean, combined with the exposure of the Cape to the unobstructed fetch of the Southern Ocean, produced seas of a size and unpredictability that could test even the most experienced crews. Ships were lost at the Cape, men were lost at the Cape, but the ships that rounded it successfully emerged into the Indian Ocean with the knowledge that the most dangerous passage was behind them. From the Cape, the fleet would sail northeast across the Indian Ocean, using the monsoon system, the seasonal reversal of winds that has governed navigation in these waters since the first traders crossed them thousands of years before, to reach the Indonesian archipelago. The timing of the departure from the Netherlands was calibrated to the monsoon. Leave too early, and you arrived at the wrong phase of the wind cycle. Leave too late, and you faced contrary winds the entire way. The VOC's great trading hub in Asia was Batavia, on the northwest coast of Java, present-day Jakarta. Founded in 1619 under the aggressive direction of Jan Pieterszoon Coen, Batavia was simultaneously a fortified city, a trading post, and the administrative capital of what was becoming, year by year, a territorial empire rather than a mere commercial enterprise. The city had a canal system modelled on Amsterdam's, a town hall, a courthouse, and the infrastructure of permanent settlement. It smelled of the sea and of the jungle that pressed against its walls on the landward side, and of the spices that moved through its warehouses in quantities sufficient to alter the price of nutmeg in Amsterdam. From Batavia, VOC ships fanned out across the archipelago, to the Banda Islands for nutmeg and mace, to the Moluccas for cloves, to the ports of the Indian subcontinent for pepper and cotton textiles, to China and Japan for silk and porcelain and copper. The inter-Asian trade that the VOC conducted, buying goods in one Asian port and selling them in another without ever returning to Europe, was, in many years, more profitable than the direct trade with the Netherlands. It was a commercial sophistication that had taken the Portuguese a generation to develop and that the VOC mastered more quickly. The goods that eventually returned to Amsterdam came packed in a manner designed to preserve them through a 6-month ocean passage. Pepper was packed in heavy canvas sacks, sewn shut and stacked tight. Nutmeg came in wooden barrels, packed in lime to discourage the insect infestations that could ruin a cargo. Cloves were dried and bagged. Silk was wrapped in oilcloth against the moisture. Each item had its optimal storage conditions, its specific enemies: heat, damp, vermin, the casual handling of a sailor with no understanding of what the cargo was worth, and the supercargo's job was to manage all of it, all the way home. When a fleet was sighted off the Dutch coast, when the coastal watchers posted at Texel or Den Helder saw the masts emerging from the sea haze and lit the signal fires, the news travelled to Amsterdam with remarkable speed. By the time the ships were entering the Zuider Zee, the Beurs would already be reacting. Buyers who had been waiting for the fleet's return would be adjusting their bids. Sellers who had planned to sell on good news would be deciding whether the news was good enough. The prices would be moving before a single sack of pepper had been unloaded. This was the essential miracle of the share market. The translation of physical reality, ships, cargoes, distant markets, tropical storms, into the abstract language of price. The man in the Beur courtyard who bid 110% of par value for VOC shares because he had heard that the returning fleet was carrying an exceptionally large cargo of nutmeg was doing something genuinely new in the history of commerce. He was buying a fraction of a claim on the value of goods that were still at sea, priced by information that was months old, mediated by an institution that had existed for less than a decade. The distance between the Beur courtyard and the Banda Sea was not merely geographic. It was a distance between two kinds of reality: the concrete, physical, dangerous reality of a ship in the Indian Ocean, and the abstract, numerical, institutional reality of a share price in Amsterdam. The Vox had built a bridge between these two realities, a bridge made of charters and ledgers and standardized weights and reliable bank guilders, and commerce flowed across it in both directions. In the hold of the returning ship, the nutmeg pressed against its barrel staves in the dark. Above it, in the decks above, sailors who had been at sea for the better part of a year slept the sleep of men who were almost home. The ship moved through the grey North Sea water with the particular energy of a vessel that can smell its harbour. The coastline of the Dutch Republic emerged from the grey horizon, flat and green and real. In Amsterdam the candles burned in the counting houses. The quills moved across the ledger pages. The world was being priced again in the only way it knew how to be, one transaction at a time. Isaac Lemaire was not a man who forgave easily. He had come to Amsterdam as a refugee, a Protestant from the southern Netherlands displaced by the Spanish reconquest of Antwerp, arriving in the northern city with the energy and the business acumen that characterised so many of the Flemish merchants who resettled there in the 1580s and 1590s. He had prospered in Amsterdam with the speed that the city rewarded to those who combined intelligence with industry. By the time the VOC was being organised in 1602, Lemaire was one of the wealthiest merchants in the city, a man whose commercial relationships stretched from the Baltic to the Levant, and whose subscription to the new company, 85,000 guilders, one of the largest individual investments in the initial offering, reflected both his financial capacity and his belief in the enterprise. He was also one of the original directors of the Amsterdam Chamber, a member of the Heeren 17th, a man at the centre of the company's governance. For a few years the arrangement suited him. The VOC's first fleets were returning with cargoes, the share price was performing adequately, and Lemaire's position in the company's hierarchy gave him access to information and influence that he knew how to use. Then, in 1605, things went wrong. The exact circumstances remained somewhat obscure, as they often do in historical disputes where the losing party had reason to suppress documentation. What is clear is that Lemaire was accused by his fellow directors of unauthorised trading, of dealing in goods and routes that fell within the VOC's monopoly, but for his own account rather than the company's. The accusation, if true, represented a serious breach of his obligations as a director. Le Maire denied the charges, but the Heeren 16th removed him from the board, demanded repayment of what they assessed as his illicit profits, and imposed a 10-year ban on his participation in any competing trade. He was expelled, publicly, formally, from the company he had helped to found and in which he remained a significant shareholder. The grudge that this produced was, by any measure, extraordinary in its consequences. Le Maire spent the years after his expulsion doing what expelled men of intelligence and capital often do. He plotted. He consulted lawyers about the terms of his ban. He explored alternative trading ventures that might operate outside the VOC's monopoly, most notably an attempt to find a new route to Asia via the Northwest Passage that would avoid the Cape of Good Hope route entirely, and thus technically escape the geographic boundaries of the VOC's charter. This venture, funded by Le Maire and his associates, would eventually result in the discovery of Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, in 1616, one of the more remarkable footnotes in the story of a man who is primarily remembered for other things. But his most consequential act came earlier. In 1609, Le Maire organised a group of investors, perhaps 20 or so, a mix of disgruntled shareholders and pure speculators, and began to execute a coordinated strategy designed to drive down the price of VOC shares and profit from the decline. The strategy was straightforward in principle, though complex in execution. The group sold large quantities of VOC shares that they did not own, short sales in the modern terminology, entering into contracts to deliver shares at a future date at prices that were fixed in advance. Their bet was that the market price of VOC shares would fall between the date of the contract and the delivery date, allowing them to buy the shares they needed to deliver at prices lower than those at which they had agreed to sell. The difference would be their profit. To make the price fall, Le Maire's group did more than simply sell. They spread rumours. They cultivated pessimism about the company's prospects, about the state of the Asian trade, about the competition from the English East India Company, about the quality of the returning fleet's cargoes. In a market where information was scarce and the news from Asia was months old, the deliberate circulation of negative rumours had real power to move prices. Investors who heard consistently gloomy assessments of the company's future would be more inclined to sell or less inclined to buy, and the cumulative effect of this reduced demand would push the price down. The VOC's directors were not slow to notice what was happening. The price of the company's shares was falling in ways that did not correspond to any news they were aware of. The Heeren 16 made inquiries, identified Le Maire's role in the decline, and brought the matter to the States General. The response of the States General was the first example of securities regulation in recorded history. In February of 1610, the States General issued a decree prohibiting the short sale of VOC shares, specifically the practice of selling shares that the seller did not actually hold at the time of the contract. The decree was grounded in a moral argument as much as a commercial one. The practice of selling what you did not own was described as a form of fraudulent dealing, incompatible with honest commerce. The decree was not especially effective. Short selling in the VOC shares continued in various forms for the remainder of the company's existence. The practice was too commercially useful. It allowed investors to express negative views, to hedge existing positions, to earn returns in declining markets, to be eliminated by regulatory fiat, and the ingenuity of Amsterdam's financial community was more than sufficient to find ways around whatever specific prohibition was imposed. The Beurs operated according to the logic of commerce, not the logic of legislation, and the two did not always align. But the decree mattered as a precedent. It established that the state had an interest in the orderly operation of the securities market, that the practices of buyers and sellers in the Beurs were not merely private matters, but public concerns, affecting the stability of the Republic's most important commercial enterprise and, through it, the broader economic health of the nation. the idea that markets needed regulation, that the freedom of buyers and sellers to transact needed to be bounded by rules designed to protect the integrity of the market itself, was not invented in Amsterdam in 1610. But it received, in that year, its first formal legal expression in the context of a public securities market. Le Maire's bear raid was ultimately not a success. The share price recovered as the fleet returned with positive news, and the short sellers who had committed to delivering shares at what now appeared to be favourable prices found themselves buying into a rising market. The precise financial outcome of the campaign is not fully documented, but the circumstantial evidence suggests that it was not the clean profit Le Maire had anticipated. He continued his career, founding his new trading company, sponsoring the voyage that discovered Cape Horn, accumulating and losing fortunes in the manner of men who cannot be still. He died in 1624, having outlived his grudge without quite satisfying it. The VOC shares, meanwhile, had survived their first concerted bear raid, weathered the world's first attempt at short-selling regulation, and continued to trade in the Beurs courtyard with the resilience of an institution that had already demonstrated its capacity to absorb the creative aggression of its own investors. The 1610 prohibition on short-selling is worth examining closely, because the arguments made for and against it are recognisable in every subsequent debate about securities regulation that has occurred in the 4 centuries since. The VOC's directors argued that short-selling was inherently destabilising, that it allowed unscrupulous actors to profit from harm to the company, that it created artificial downward pressure on the share price that bore no relationship to the company's actual commercial performance, and that it damaged the confidence of legitimate long-term investors who found the value of their holdings eroded by speculation they had not authorised. The short sellers, Le Maire's group, and others who followed similar strategies, argued, when they argued at all, that they were simply expressing genuine views about the company's value. If they believed the shares were overpriced relative to the company's actual prospects, they had every right to act on that belief, and the information their trading conveyed about collective pessimism was itself useful to the market. A share price that could only go up, that was protected from downward pressure by regulatory prohibition, was not a price that accurately reflected the full range of market opinion. Both arguments contained genuine insight. The short sellers were right that prohibition could not eliminate the underlying reality that the shares might be overvalued, and that a market without mechanisms for expressing negative views would tend toward dangerous optimism. The VC's directors were right that the deliberate spreading of false rumours to drive down prices was a form of fraud, distinct from legitimate short-selling based on genuine analysis and deserving of legal sanction. The difficulty, then as now, was in drawing the line between these two activities cleanly. The 1610 decree drew the line badly, prohibiting the form rather than the abuse, and the Beurs simply worked around it. But the attempt to draw the line at all was significant. It established that the secondary market for securities was a matter of public concern, that what happened in the Beurs courtyard was not merely a private affair between buyers and sellers, but an activity with systemic consequences that justified regulatory oversight. The market was maturing. It was learning, through experience rather than theory, what a market could bear and what it could not. Each crisis, each manipulation, each regulatory response added a layer of understanding, not always comfortable, not always fair, but accumulating into something that would eventually be called market wisdom. The candles burned late in the counting houses. Outside, the canal reflected the stars. In the spring of 1605, the VOC paid its first dividend. It was not paid in money. The shareholders who gathered, or sent their agents, to collect the distribution that the Heeren 16 had declared received, instead, mace. The dried red membrane that encloses the nutmeg seed, harvested from the Banda Islands at considerable cost in both capital and human effort, pressed into the hands of the company's investors as evidence that the enterprise was, at least in some tangible sense, producing results. The choice to pay in spice rather than coin was not made from poverty. The Volks had money, or rather, the The Voyages had the proceeds of spice sales, which amounted to the same thing, but the directors had made a decision that reflected both their commercial pragmatism and the particular situation of a new company with enormous capital needs. Paying a dividend in spice rather than cash allowed them to distribute value to shareholders without depleting the bank guilder balances that the company needed to fund ongoing operations, to equip new ships, to maintain the fortifications in Asia that the company's expanding territorial presence required. There was also perhaps something symbolically fitting about a spice company paying its dividends in spice. The mace that shareholders received was itself a kind of proof of concept, evidence that the company's ships had reached the Banda Islands, that the nutmeg trees were producing, that the trade was real. You could smell the dividend, you could hold it in your hand. It was, in a sense, the most honest possible statement of what the company was, an enterprise that transformed distance and labour and risk into something warm and fragrant and worth carrying home. Later dividends were paid in pepper, in cloves, and eventually, as the company's financial position solidified and its cash flows became more predictable, in coin. The amounts varied considerably from year to year, reflecting both the actual profitability of the company's operations and the directors' judgments about how much capital the company needed to retain. In good years, dividends could be substantial. At moments in the 1630s and 1640s, when the VOC's dominance of the spice trade was most complete and its profit margins were widest, dividends as high as 40 or even 50% of the original subscription value were distributed in a single year. These numbers require careful interpretation. A 40% dividend did not mean that the company had earned 40% returns on its capital in that year. It meant that the directors had decided to distribute 40% of par value from the accumulated earnings of the company, which might represent many years of retained profits finally being released. The accounting of the VOC was opaque by modern standards, deliberately so. The Heeren 16 were not required to publish regular accounts, and the shareholders who had entrusted their capital to the company had very limited visibility into what was happening to it. This opacity was not merely an inconvenience for investors. It was a structural feature of the early corporate form, and it reflected a fundamental tension that would take centuries to fully resolve. The tension between the shareholders who owned the company and the directors who managed it. In a sole proprietorship or a partnership, the people who owned the business were typically the same people who managed it, and the information asymmetry was minimal. In a publicly held corporation, a company with hundreds or thousands of shareholders who were not involved in management, the owners and the managers were different people, with potentially different interests and access to different information. The shareholders of the VOC had invested their capital in an enterprise they did not control and could not closely monitor. They depended on the honesty and competence of the Heeren 17th for the returns on their investment. They had limited ability to verify the directors' claims about the company's financial position, and they had almost no ability to replace incompetent or dishonest directors without the cooperation of the political authorities that had established the company in the first place. This principal-agent problem, the problem of ensuring that the people who manage assets behave in the interests of the people who own those assets, is one of the defining challenges of corporate governance, and it was present from the very beginning of the corporate form. The VOC shareholders were not helpless. They could sell their shares if they were dissatisfied, and the pressure of a declining share price was itself a form of governance, signalling to directors that the market had lost confidence in their stewardship. But selling was not the same as controlling, and the voice that shareholders had in the company's decisions was, at best, indirect. What kept the system functioning? What maintained the investors' willingness to hold shares in a company they could not directly govern? Was precisely the transferability of the shares. An investor who was dissatisfied with the VOC's management could sell his shares to someone who was less dissatisfied, or more optimistic, or simply more willing to accept the opacity in exchange for the possibility of future returns. The secondary market was, among other things, an exit valve, a mechanism by which investors who had lost faith could be replaced by investors who had not. The concept of permanent capital, capital that remained invested in the company indefinitely, rather than being returned after each voyage, was itself a crucial innovation that the dividend mechanism had to work around rather than with. In the earlier voyage-by-voyage structure, investors knew exactly when they would get their money back. When the voyage concluded, the cargo was sold and the accounts were settled. In the VOC structure, there was no scheduled return of capital. The company would persist and investors' capital would remain committed for as long as the company existed. This permanence was one of the VOC's great strengths. It meant that the company could make investments with long-time horizons, building a fortification in Batavia that would not pay for itself for a decade, developing a trading relationship with a Japanese partner that required years of cultivation, without the pressure of returning capital to investors at the end of each voyage. The Dutch word for this kind of permanent capital, vast goed, literally means fixed goods, and the idea that capital fixed in an enterprise could be more productive than capital circulating through one venture after another was, in 1602, not yet fully understood even by the people who had created the structure that embodied it. The balance sheet, the accounting tool that captures the relationship between a company's assets and its obligations at a specific point in time, was another innovation that the VOC helped to develop, not through deliberate design, but through the practical necessity of tracking an enterprise of unprecedented complexity. A company with assets distributed across 3 continents, with debts owed and owing in multiple currencies, with ships at sea whose value was uncertain and cargoes whose market value fluctuated daily, needed accounting tools that could represent this complexity in a manageable form. The VOC's bookkeepers developed their tools incrementally, adapting the double-entry accounting they had learned from the Italian tradition to the specific demands of a global enterprise. The result was not a clean, modern balance sheet. It was a document full of approximations, conventions, and deliberate obscurities that served the directors' interests more than the shareholders. But it was an attempt to represent the financial position of an ongoing enterprise at a point in time, and it was recognizably the ancestor of the accounting documents that publicly held corporations publish today. The dream of permanence, the idea that a commercial enterprise could exist indefinitely, transcending the deaths of its founders and the turnover of its investors, sustained by the continuous reinvestment of its earnings and the ongoing confidence of the market in its shares, was perhaps the most radical innovation embedded in the VOC's structure. It was a dream that took decades to fully realize and that required the development of the entire ecosystem of corporate law, accounting standards, and investor protection that has been built up since 1602. But the dream was there, in the charter, in the share register, in the dividend paid in mace on a spring morning in 1605. The company would endure. The ownership of the company would circulate. The value of that ownership would fluctuate. And somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the ships would keep sailing, carrying the distance between the world's supply of spices and the world's demand for them, converting that distance into the numbers that moved on the ledger pages of Amsterdam. The shareholder who held VOC shares for a decade, who had subscribed in 1602 and was still holding in 1612, had participated in something genuinely unprecedented. A decade-long investment in a permanent enterprise, funded by distributed public capital, governed by professional managers, sustained by the transferability of shares in a secondary market. The experience was new enough that the vocabulary for describing it was still being invented. The Dutch language of commerce was developing new words and new phrases: aandeel for share, koers for price, dividend for the periodic distribution of profits, that did not exist in their current commercial meanings before the VOC created the need for them. These linguistic innovations are not trivial. The vocabulary of a culture shapes what its members can think clearly about, and the development of a precise commercial vocabulary for the concepts of the share market, for fractional ownership, for price discovery, for the distribution of enterprise profits, was itself a cognitive achievement. The merchants and investors and brokers of Amsterdam were, in their daily commercial practice, developing the conceptual toolkit that the modern financial world takes entirely for granted. The dividend paid in mace in 1605 was the first expression of this toolkit in action. A company that had raised capital from the public was returning a portion of its proceeds to those members of the public who had invested. The amount was determined by the directors. The mechanism was the periodic distribution of value from the enterprise to its fractional owners. The calculation required an accounting of what the company had earned, what it needed to retain for future operations, and what it could afford to distribute. Each of these steps, the earning, the retention decision, the distribution, was new ground being broken in real time by real people with real money at stake. The mace dried in the morning air. The ink darkened on the page. The dream held its shape, improbable and precise. There is a moment in the history of every large commercial enterprise when the logic of commerce and the logic of power become indistinguishable from each other. For the VOC, that moment came gradually, then all at once, during the decade between 1610 and 1620, a decade shaped, more than by any other single force, by the personality and the vision of Pieterszoon Coen. Coen was not a man of the counting house. He had been trained in commerce, apprenticed to a Roman banking house as a young man, educated in the double-entry bookkeeping and letter of credit mechanisms of Italian financial practice. But what animated him was not the careful management of margins and inventories. It was power, specifically the power to impose Dutch commercial dominance on the Indian Ocean, with a thoroughness that the cautious, profit-focused merchants of the Heeren, Sixtenthaven had not imagined, and would not, left to themselves, have attempted. Coen arrived in the East Indies in 1607, a young man in his early 20s, and rose through the company's administrative hierarchy with a speed that reflected both his abilities and the chronic shortage of competent managers that the VOC faced in its Asian operations. By 1613, he was the company's Director General in Asia, the effective CEO of the company's operations east of the Cape, and by 1617 he had been appointed Governor General, the highest position in the VOC's Asian hierarchy. His vision was simple to state and brutal to execute. The VOC, Coen believed, would never achieve its potential as a commercial enterprise as long as it remained dependent on the willingness of Asian rulers and Asian traders to sell it goods at market prices. True commercial dominance required territorial control, the ability to determine, by force if necessary, who could trade, where they could trade, and at what prices. The VOC's charter had granted it the right to make war and establish colonies precisely because the Republic statesmen had understood this logic. Coen intended to use these powers to their fullest extent. The establishment of Batavia in 1619 was the centrepiece of Coen's territorial ambition. The site he chose, on the northwestern coast of Java, near the existing port city of Jayakarta, was strategically ideal. Deep water for large ships, a defensible position, and proximity to the Sunda Strait, the passage between Java and Sumatra through which much of the eastern trade passed. Coen took the site by force, destroying the existing city and its inhabitants in the process, and built in its place a Dutch city with straight canals, a fortified warehouse district, a town hall, and the infrastructure of permanent settlement. Batavia became the hub of the VOC's inter-Asian trade network, the point through which goods from Japan, China, India, and the Indonesian archipelago were routed and redistributed. The city grew quickly, attracting traders from across Asia who were willing to accept the VOC's terms in exchange for access to its commercial networks. It was, in its functioning, a genuinely cosmopolitan city. Chinese merchants lived alongside Javanese traders, alongside Dutch officials, alongside South Asian textile dealers. Though the cosmopolitanism operated within a hierarchy that placed Dutch authority at the apex, and all others below it in a descending order of privilege and protection. The Spice Islands presented a different challenge. Nutmeg grew nowhere in the world except the Banda Islands, a small cluster of volcanic islands in the Banda Sea, remote and difficult to reach, and inhabited by a people who had been trading their nutmeg with the wider world for centuries before the first Dutch ship appeared on their horizon. The Bandanese had their own trading relationships, their own political structures, their own ideas about who could buy their nutmeg and at what price. They sold to whoever offered the best terms, to the Portuguese, to the English, to the VOC, to the private traders who operated outside all three companies' official structures. Coen found this commercial independence intolerable. The VOC's monopoly on Dutch nutmeg trade was legally established. But a monopoly on buying is only as valuable as your ability to prevent others from buying. And the Bandanese, by selling to English traders and to unlicensed Dutch merchants, were undermining the exclusivity that made the nutmeg trade so profitable. Coen's solution was to eliminate the Bandanese as an independent economic actor. Between 1621 and 1622, Coen organised a series of military campaigns against the Banda Islands that resulted in the death or expulsion of the vast majority of the island's population. The Banda Islands, which had perhaps 15,000 inhabitants before 1621, were left with perhaps 1,000 by 1622. The nutmeg groves were redistributed to Dutch planters, called perkeneers, who were granted the right to cultivate and sell their nutmeg exclusively to the VOC at prices set by the company. The Banda Islands had been transformed from an independent trading partner into a company plantation, and the nutmeg monopoly was complete. The same logic applied with varying degrees of violence across the VOC's sphere of operations. The clove trade on the Moluccan islands of Ternate and Tidore was subjected to a policy called the Hongi Raids, annual naval expeditions that destroyed clove trees growing outside the areas the VOC had designated for production, ensuring that the supply of cloves remained under company control. The pepper trade on the coast of Java was reorganised through a series of treaties, some negotiated, some imposed, that gave the company preferential access to production regions. The shareholders in Amsterdam, receiving their dividends in coin or in spice, were not entirely ignorant of how these dividends were being produced. Reports came back from Asia. Travellers returned with accounts of what the company was doing in its name. The Dutch public press, one of the freest in Europe, occasionally published critical commentary on the company's methods. But the distance was vast and the information was filtered and the dividends were real. There is a tension here that the history of the VOC does not resolve cleanly, because it cannot be resolved cleanly. The financial innovations that the VOC pioneered, the public share offering, the transferable equity, the secondary market, the permanent capital structure, were genuine contributions to human commercial organisation, and the institutions that descended from them have, on balance, created enormous wealth and enabled genuine human flourishing. But those innovations were, in the early 17th century, directly funded by and directly funding the brutal suppression of the peoples who grew the spices those innovations were designed to trade. The VOC was not unusual in this respect. The commercial empires of Spain, Portugal, England and France were all built on the same foundation of violence and extraction. What made the VOC unusual was the financial sophistication of the structure through which it operated, the degree to which the violence and extraction had been embedded in and made productive by a set of institutional innovations that would outlast the empire itself. There is another dimension to the VOC's territorial expansion that the shareholder in Amsterdam experienced not as distant violence but as share price performance. The correlation was not perfect. The market's information about what was happening in the Banda Islands in 1621 would have been fragmentary and delayed by months, but it was real. The completion of the nutmeg monopoly made the VOC's spice revenues more predictable and its profit margins wider. The share price responded over time to the commercial consequences of the territorial strategy, even if it could not directly price the methods by which those consequences were achieved. This disconnect between method and market price is one of the more uncomfortable features of the VOC's history for a modern investor to contemplate. The share price was a number. The number represented a collective judgment about the company's future earnings. The future earnings depended in part on the company's ability to maintain its monopolies. The maintenance of its monopolies depended in the Banda Islands on the elimination of an alternative supply. The elimination of an alternative supply had required the near destruction of the Bandanese people. The share price did not contain any of this information explicitly. It contained only the forward-looking commercial implication that the nutmeg trade was now more reliably profitable than it had been before. The modern world has inherited both aspects of this system. The corporate structures and financial markets that descended from the VOC have created genuine wealth on a scale that would have been inconceivable to the merchants of Amsterdam in 1602. The standard of living available to a person of modest means in a developed economy today, the medical care, the variety of food, the access to information, the physical comfort, exceeds what the wealthiest VOC shareholder could have imagined. This is not a small thing. The institutions of capital markets and corporate law that the VOC pioneered have, over 4 centuries, produced material results that are among the most significant achievements in human economic history. But those institutions were developed and first applied in a context of colonial extraction and violence that cannot be separated from the financial innovation. The two were not coincidental. The financial innovation was developed specifically to fund and manage the colonial enterprise, and the colonial enterprise was the primary source of the returns that made the financial innovation attractive. To take credit for one while disclaiming the other would be a historical distortion. The shadow falls across the ledger, the numbers are precise, and the ink is clear, but the world from which the numbers are drawn is wider and darker than any ledger can fully contain. The ships sailed on, the dividends were paid, the share price rose and fell and rose again, and in the counting houses of Amsterdam, the candles burned against the dark, illuminating the pages of a story that was more complicated than any of its authors knew how to tell. The VOC did not fall suddenly. It declined the way large institutions always decline, slowly, then with gathering speed, the rot spreading from the periphery toward the centre, before most people could see it clearly. The signs were visible by the mid-18th century to anyone who wished to look. The company's dividend payments, which had been generous in the great decades of the early and mid-17th century, had become irregular and then increasingly dependent on borrowed money rather than genuine earnings. The Heeren-17ths were distributing funds that the company didn't have, borrowing from the Amsterdam capital markets to pay dividends that were supposed to demonstrate the company's prosperity, a circular arrangement that could sustain itself only as long as creditors were willing to lend. The corruption that had always been present in a sprawling, poorly monitored enterprise operating across half a world had, by the 18th century, become systemic. The company's servants in Asia, the traders, the administrators, the soldiers, the officials who managed its far-flung operations, had developed elaborate private trading networks that diverted commercial opportunities from the company to themselves. The pepper that should have filled the VOC's holds filled their own. The relationships with Asian rulers that should have been maintained for the company's benefit were maintained, instead, for personal profit. This private trading was not entirely illegal by the standards of the time. Many of the company's contracts with its employees explicitly permitted them to trade on their own account within certain limits. But the limits were elastic, the monitoring was minimal, and the culture of self-dealing had spread from the tolerated margins to the centre of the company's operations. The VOC was, by the 1750s, not primarily a trading company that permitted some private commerce by its employees. It had become, in many of its Asian operations, a structure within which private commerce operated, and the company's official trade was an afterthought. The competitive landscape had also shifted in ways that the company could not fully adapt to. The VOC's great commercial achievement in the early 17th century had been the construction of a monopoly, the elimination of Asian suppliers' ability to sell to multiple buyers, the concentration of the spice trade through Dutch hands, the pricing power that came from controlling both the supply and the distribution of the most valuable commodities in the world. This monopoly had been maintained by force, by treaty, and by the sheer commercial and military dominance that the company had achieved at the peak of its power. By the 18th century, the monopoly was eroding. Other European powers had established their own presence in the Asian trade. The English East India Company had grown from the small, struggling enterprise that had competed nervously with the VOC in the early 1600s into a significant commercial and territorial power in its own right, particularly in India. The French Compagnie des Indes had carved out its own niches. The forces of economic competition that the VOC's founders had sought to suppress in the Dutch Republic in 1602 had re-emerged on an intercontinental scale, and the tools the VOC had used to suppress competition, military force, monopoly charters, territorial control, were no longer exclusively available to the Dutch. The spice monopoly itself had been undermined by the smuggling that the company's own brutality had incentivized. Nutmeg and clove plants had been taken from the Banda Islands and the Moluccas by various means, some deliberate, some accidental, and transplanted to other tropical regions. By the late 18th century, nutmeg was growing in Mauritius, in Grenada, in Penang. The botanical monopoly that had underlain the commercial monopoly was broken, and with it went much of the pricing power that had made the spice trade so lucrative. The VOC's debt accumulated with the relentless patience of compound interest. By the 1780s, the company owed approximately 110 million guilders, a sum so large that the annual interest payments on it exceeded the revenues from its commercial operations. The company was, in any meaningful sense, insolvent. Its liabilities exceeded its assets, and its ability to service its debts depended entirely on the willingness of creditors to extend new loans and on the political support of the Dutch state. The political support was itself contingent on a Dutch republic that was increasingly consumed by its own crisis. The late 18th century was a period of profound political turbulence in the Netherlands. The struggle between the Orangist faction and the Patriot movement, the French invasion of 1795, the transformation of the Republic into the Batavian Republic under French influence. The institutions that had sustained the VOC, the States General, the provincial governments, the Amsterdam City Council, were themselves in flux, their authority contested, their capacity to provide the political backstop the company required significantly diminished. The charter of the VOC, originally granted for 21 years and renewed repeatedly since 1602, came up for renewal in 1798. The Batavian Republic, the successor state to the Dutch Republic, declined to renew it. The company was given 2 years to wind down its affairs. On the last day of December 1799, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie ceased to exist. The Batavian Republic assumed the company's debts, approximately 110 million guilders, distributed among the creditors who had sustained the company through its final decades. It also assumed the company's territorial possessions in Asia, which became, in time, the Dutch colonial empire and eventually the modern nation of Indonesia. The transition from corporate governance to state governance was not entirely smooth, but it was, by the standards of the era, managed with reasonable order. The share register, those great ledger books in which the names and numbers of VOC investors had been recorded since 1602, was eventually deposited in the archives where it remains today, the oldest surviving share register of a publicly traded company. The names on its pages, the great merchants of Amsterdam, the silk dyer of Middelburg, The carpenter's assistant of Enkhuizen, who had found 50 guilders, are the first shareholders in human history, the first participants in the experiment in collective ownership and financial abstraction that the company had launched 2 centuries earlier. What the VOC left behind was not the company itself, but the idea of the company. The legal concept of the publicly held corporation, the enterprise owned in divisible fractions by numerous investors, managed by professional directors, governed by a charter, sustained by transferable shares traded in an organised market, had existed only in the VOC's specific form before 1602. After 1602, it existed as a general concept, available to be adopted, adapted and extended by any state and any merchant community with the legal sophistication and the commercial need to use it. The English joint stock companies that expanded through the 17th and 18th centuries, not just the East India Company, but the Hudson's Bay Company, the Royal African Company, the Bank of England, all drew on the template that the VOC had established, adapting it to English law and English circumstances but retaining the essential structure: public ownership, transferable shares, permanent capital, professional management. The Amsterdam Beurs and its practices, the forward contracts, the options, the short selling, the broker networks, the price discovery mechanisms, were studied and imitated by the merchants and statesmen who established stock exchanges in London and Paris and eventually New York. The Wisselbank model, the public deposit bank with a stable unit of account, full reserve backing, and no credit creation, was studied by the theorists who designed the Bank of England in 1694 and the institutions that followed it. The accounting innovations forced by the VOC's complexity, the approximation of the balance sheet, the tracking of assets across multiple jurisdictions, the management of liabilities in multiple currencies, fed into the gradual development of modern accounting standards. None of this inheritance was clean. The institutions that descended from the VOC carried with them the tensions and contradictions that the VOC itself had embodied. The tension between owners and managers, between commercial efficiency and political accountability, between the creation of wealth and the distribution of its costs and benefits. These tensions have never been resolved, only managed through 2 centuries of corporate law, financial regulation, and periodic crisis. The canal is quiet now. The water moves with the small, unhurried motion of deep water, and the reflections of the brick facades along its banks hold their shapes with the fidelity that still water always achieves. The candle in the upper window has long since gone out. The man who was bent over his ledger, writing names and numbers in the ink that would not dry for 4 centuries, has been still for a very long time. But the numbers remain. They circulate still, in forms he would not recognize and at speeds he could not have imagined, through systems so vast and so interconnected that no single mind can fully comprehend them. The share register he was filling has become the global equity market. The forward contracts negotiated in the Beurs courtyard have become the derivatives markets whose notional value exceeds the gross domestic product of the world. The Wisselbank's stable unit of account has become, in distorted, credit-expanded, politically managed form, the modern central bank and its fiat currency. The echo of that October morning in 1602 is everywhere. It is in the pension fund that holds your retirement savings. It is in the corporation whose products you use each day. It is in the stock index that tells you, at any hour, what the collective judgment of millions of buyers and sellers believes the future to be worth. The candle is out. The man is still. The ledger is in the archive. But the numbers move on. The VOC's original subscription register is held today in the Amsterdam City Archives on the Wisselstraat. It is a large bound volume, the pages somewhat yellowed at the edges, the ink settled into the particular brown that black ink achieves over 4 centuries. The names are legible, the numbers are clear. The Amsterdam Beurs building that Hendrik de Keyser designed in 1611 no longer functions as a stock exchange. It has served over the centuries as a commodities exchange, a concert hall, and most recently as a shopping arcade. The arcade is pleasant and somewhat characterless, which is perhaps fitting for a space whose original purpose was something so radically new that the building has spent 4 centuries looking for a comparable use. The Wisselbank continued to operate until 1820, when it was formally dissolved by the newly established Kingdom of the Netherlands. In its final decades, it had drifted considerably from its original principles, extending credit against its deposits in ways that compromised the full reserve backing that had been its founding virtue. The institution that had provided the monetary foundation for the world's first securities market ended its life as an ordinary bank. The share register in the Amsterdam City Archives contains, among thousands of other names, the entry of a silk dyer from Middelburg who subscribed for 150 guilders in the summer of 1602. His name is not famous. His life is not documented beyond this single entry. But his decision to take a portion of his savings and invest it in a fraction of an enterprise he could not manage or monitor, sailing to the other side of the world, governed by men he would never meet, was the founding gesture of modern capitalism. He trusted that the structure would hold. He trusted that the numbers in the book meant what they said. He trusted that the men sailing the ships were doing what the charter said they would do. The trust was imperfect. The structure was imperfect. The numbers were imperfect. The men were imperfect. But it held long enough to demonstrate that the idea was sound. The canal is still there. The water still moves. And somewhere in the archives the name is still legible, written in ink that has lasted 400 years. The story is complete now. You have followed the scent of pepper across centuries, through counting houses and canal-side mornings, through the ink of ledgers and the salt of the Indian Ocean. You have been present at the founding of something that, in the quiet way of world-changing things, did not announce itself as such. Let the numbers settle now. Let the ships sail on without you. Let the names in the register go quiet. The water moves in the canal. The light is the soft grey of a northern morning that is not quite ready to begin. Somewhere behind you, a bakery has been burning wood since before the sky brightened, and the smell of bread moves through the cold air, and the city breathes in and out in the slow rhythm of a place that has seen everything and is not yet done. If you are drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.